Hi students, in our previous lesson 5 we discussed about whether sociology is a science or not. In this lesson, which is on scientific method, we will discuss about various aspects of scientific method. Social research is a method used by social scientists and researchers to understand about people, human behavior, societies and social problems to cater to various needs of the people. Social research is initiated by new challenges, emerging needs, social changes, etc. Human behavior is not uniform and predictable, is more often than not uncertain. All people do not behave in the same way in similar circumstance similarly. One individual may behave differently under similar circumstances. Human society, behavior and interaction are highly heterogeneous and unpredictable. Thus, collecting reliable scientific data is challenging. Nevertheless, scientific method can be used in social research by overcoming the difficulties. Broad predictions and generalizations can be arrived at. Personal prejudices of human behavior in social settings can be minimized with the help of some standard techniques developed for the purpose. After completion of this lesson, you will be able to understand the meaning and features of scientific method, importance of scientific method in social research. Scientific method. The word science is derived from the Latin word scientia, which is knowledge based on demonstrable and reproducible data according to the Merriam-Webster dictionary. Science aims for measurable results through testing and analysis. Science is based on fact, not opinion or preferences. The process of science is designed to challenge ideas through research. When conducting research, scientists use the scientific method to collect measurable empirical evidence in an experiment related to a hypothesis, often in the form of an if or then statement, the results aiming to support or contradict a theory. The scientific method is a system that attempts to separate the bias of being an observer from the observation, letting reality show itself in the simplest possible way. The primary steps of which are systematic and repeatable observation, exact measurements, experiments and the invention of and repeated, ideally nearly endless testing of theories. It is a method of investigation based on what's termed empirical and measurable evidence. Empirical means what can be observed with the senses, and measurable meaning what can be repeatedly quantified in a standardized way. The essential purpose of science is the creation of theories or hypotheses that can consistently and reliably explain or reproduce observed phenomena. The scientific method is the method of creating these reliable and reproducible theories. Scientific method refers to a standardized set of techniques for building scientific knowledge, such as how to make valid observations, how to interpret results and how to generalize those results. The scientific method allows researchers to independently and impartially test pre-existing theories and prior findings and subject them to open debate, modifications or enhancements. According to Carl Pearson, English mathematician, scientific method is marked by three features. They are: firstly, careful and accurate classification of facts and observation of their correlation and sequence. Secondly, discovery of scientific laws with the aid of creative imagination. And thirdly, self-criticism. George Lundberg, the American sociologist, defines scientific method as one consisting of systematic observation, classification and interpretation of data. The main difference between day-to-day generalization and the scientific method lies in the degree of formality, rigorousness, verifiability and the general validity of the latter. Sociologists make use of methods such as experiments, surveys, field research and textual analysis. A scientific process of research establishes parameters that help make sure results are objective and accurate. Scientific methods provide limitations and boundaries that focus a study and organize its results. This is the case for both positivist or quantitative methodologies and interpretive or qualitative methodologies. The scientific method involves developing and testing theories about the world based on empirical evidence. It is defined by its commitment to systematic observation of the empirical world and strives to be objective, critical, skeptical and logical. It involves a series of prescribed steps that have been established over centuries of scholarship. Characteristics of scientific method. Scientific method is based on reliance on empirical evidence, use of concepts, logical constructs or abstractions created from sense impressions, percepts and experiences. Ethical neutrality. Research does not pass judgment. Generalizations refers to the process of drawing a general conclusion from specific observations. Logical reasoning consists of induction, that is, studying several individual cases and drawing generalizations, and deduction, that is, reasoning from general to particular. Objectivity. Any study is considered to be objective when it is based upon the observation of the factual events and not upon personal judgments. However, achieving absolute objectivity is difficult in social sciences. Reliability. The degree to which scores of a test remain constant for the same unit of measurement over times. A scale is reliable when it will consistently produce the same results when applied to the same sample. Reliability can be measured in the following ways. Test-retest method. Scale is applied to the same population and results are compared. Multiple form method. Two forms of the scale are constructed to begin with and alternate forms are administered successively to the same sample. Split half method. It is the modification of the multiple form approach and the scale is divided randomly into two halves. Validity. Any measuring instrument is valid when it measures most accurately the objects or individuals and their characteristics. The different types of validity are predictive validity, which means the extent to which study implies predictive power. Concurrent validity. It tests that help to distinguish the individual who differ in their present state is said to have concurrent validity. Tests which distinguish individuals who would differ in the future is said to have predictive validity. Content validity. It is the representativeness of the content. It involves judging the representativeness of the items, that is, how far they represent the content or universe of the content of the property being measured. Construct validity. It means determining which factors or properties can explain the variation in the scores. In other words, which factors are responsible and therefore should be used to explain the differences among the individuals and groups in their test scores. Many characteristics are abstract in nature and need to be defined operationally for measurement. These are called constructs. The researcher, after locating the variables or factors, attempt to trace out the nature, type and degree of relationship among different variables. Verifiability. The process of verification consists of repeated study of the same thing under similar conditions in order to check the accuracy of conclusion or inferences drawn. Scrutinizable. The procedures used and the inferences derived must withstand critical scrutiny or peer review by other scientists. The overall approach to research of any variety is what is generally termed as the scientific method. The conclusion which is arrived at by the scientific method has an objective validity. The objective nature of the scientific method is its greatest quality. However, there are certain significant difficulties in the use of scientific methods. Some of these difficulties are: it is very difficult to classify human behavior since it is complicated, subtle and varied. When human behavior is studied and analyzed by other human beings, the personal and emotional features come into picture and may distort the facts. Different aspects of human behavior are psychological in nature and thus measurement becomes challenging. People behave differently under similar circumstances. Since human behavior is not uniform and thus generalizing and predicting becomes difficult. Further, reliable scientific data cannot always be collected. Few other difficulties identified in literature are problem of hurried research, problem of external pressures, emotional effects, nature and complexity of subject matter, lack of uniformity, problem of general knowledge, problem of self-interest, social philosophy and its effects, ethnocentrism, prejudices and bias, customs. Steps in scientific method. First, ask research question. Second, research existing sources. Third, formulate a hypothesis. Fourth, design and conduct the study. Fifth, draw conclusions. Sixth, report results. Sociologists can use the scientific method not only to collect but to interpret and analyze the data. Scientific method helps to maintain as much objectivity, focus and consistency as possible in a particular study. With its systematic approach, the scientific method has proven useful in shaping sociological studies. The scientific method provides a systematic, organized series of steps that help ensure objectivity and consistency in exploring a social problem. They provide the means for accuracy, reliability and validity. In the end, the scientific method provides a shared basis for discussion and analysis. The following is brief discussion about steps in scientific method. Formulating research question. The first step of the scientific method is to ask research questions, describe a problem and identify the specific area of interest. The theme should be narrow enough to study within a local area and time frame. The framing of these questions in better research terms is important. When forming these basic research questions, sociologists develop an operational definition, that is, they define the concept in terms of physical or concrete steps it takes to objectively measure it. The concept is translated into an observable variable or factor, a measure that has different values. The operational definition identifies an observable condition of the concept. By operationalizing a variable of the concept, all researchers can collect data in a systematic or replicable manner. The operational definition must be valid in the sense that it is an appropriate and meaningful measure of the concept being studied. It must also be reliable, meaning that results will be close to uniform when tested on more than one person. For example, middle class as a term can be defined as a class between upper class and lower class, but when it comes to data collection, there has to be a concrete definition in terms of income or occupation. Research existing sources, that is review of literature. The next step researchers undertake is to conduct background research through a literature review, which is a review of any existing, similar or related studies. Referring books or online sources help in comprehending existing research about the topic of study. This step helps researchers gain a broad understanding of work previously conducted on the topic at hand and enables them to position their own research to build on prior knowledge. It allows them to sharpen the focus of their research question and avoid duplicating previous research. However, citing existing sources is important. It is important to quote references properly. However, from the vast information, it is important to determine what is relevant. Referring and utilizing existing sources educates a researcher and helps refine and improve a study's design. Formulation of hypothesis. A hypothesis is an assumption about how two or more variables are related. It makes an assumption about the relationship between those variables. It is a guess based on theory, observations, patterns of experience, or the existing literature. The hypothesis is formulated in the form of a testable proposition. However, hypothesis is treated differently between the positivist and interpretive approaches. A hypothesis is derived from a theoretical proposition. On the basis of hypothesis, a prediction or generalization is logically deduced. In positivist sociology, the hypothesis predicts how one form of human behavior influences another. Successful prediction is determined by the adequacy of hypothesis and thereby test the theoretical proposition. Typically, positivist approaches operationalize variables as quantitative data, that is, by translating a social phenomenon like class into a quantifiable or numerically measurable variable like income, occupation. Thus, predictions can be formulated using statistical methods. Variables are examined to see if there is correlation between them. When a change in one variable coincides with a change in another variable, there is a correlation. This does not necessarily indicate that changes in one variable causes a change in another variable. However, just that they are associated. A key distinction here is between independent and dependent variables. In research, independent variables are the cause of the change. The dependent variable is the effect or thing that is changed. For example, in a basic study, the researcher would establish one factor or indicator as the independent variable and observe the influence it has on dependent variable. For example, how does fertilizer, the independent variable, affect agricultural productivity, which is the dependent variable? How does working hours, that is the independent variable, affect the performance, which is the dependent variable? How is social class, that is dependent variable, affected by level of education, which is the independent variable? To establish the cause of any phenomenon, three criteria must be satisfied. They are: there must be a relationship or correlation between independent and dependent variables. The independent variable must be prior to the dependent variable. Thirdly, there must be no other intervening variable responsible for the causal relationship. At this point, a researcher's operational definitions help measure the variables. Identifying the independent and dependent variables is very important. Simply identifying two topics or variables are not enough. Their prospective relationship must be part of hypothesis. Sociologists analyze general patterns in response to a study, but they are equally interested in exceptions to the patterns. While many sociologists rely on the positivist method in their research, others operate from an interpretive approach. While systematic, this approach does not follow the hypothesis testing model that seeks to make generalizable predictions from quantitative variables. Instead, an interpretive framework seeks to understand social worlds from the point of view of participants, leading to an in-depth knowledge. It focuses on the meanings that guide people's behavior. Rather than relying on quantitative instruments like questionnaires or experiments, which can be artificial, the interpretive approach attempts to find ways to get closer to the informant's lived experience and perceptions. Interpretive research is generally more descriptive or narrative in its findings. It can begin from a deductive approach by deriving a hypothesis from theory and then seeking to confirm it through methodologies like in-depth interviews. However, it is ideally suited to an inductive approach in which the hypothesis emerges only after a substantial period of direct observation or interaction with subjects. This type of approach is exploratory in that the researcher also learns as he or she proceeds, sometimes adjusting the research methods or processes midway to respond to new insights and findings as they evolve. Once the preliminary work is done, it's time for the next research steps, that is designing and conducting a study and drawing conclusions. Design and conduct study. In sociological experiments, to test a specific hypothesis and to collect data, there is need to control the environment or experiment. Controlling an experiment means controlling all of the variables so that only a single variable is studied. The independent variable is the one that's controlled and manipulated by the experimenter, whereas the dependent variable is not. As the independent variable is manipulated, the dependent variable is measured for variation. Controlling an experiment means setting it up so it has a control group and an experimental group. The control group allows the experimenter to compare his test results against a baseline measurement so he can feel confident that those results are not due to chance. Analyze data and draw a conclusion. During an experiment, scientists collect both quantitative and qualitative data. The data helps to support or reject the hypothesis. The amount of analysis required to come to a satisfactory conclusion can vary tremendously. Sometimes, statistical tools like chi-square test have to be used to analyze data. The ultimate goal is to prove or disprove the hypothesis, and in doing so, answer the original question. Report the results. The results elaborate on what happened in the experiment. It includes detailing all observations and data made during experiment. Most people find it easier to visualize the data by charting or graphing the information. Importance of scientific method. The scientific method attempts to minimize the influence of bias or prejudice in the researcher. Bias results from personal and cultural beliefs. It implies that any human or researcher filters the information based on his or her own experience. Unfortunately, this filtering process can cause a scientist to prefer one outcome over another. In the scientific community, where results have to be reviewed and duplicated, bias must be avoided at all costs. Scientific method provides an objective, standardized approach to conduct experiments, and in doing so improves their results. By using a standardized approach in their investigations, social researchers feel confident that they will stick to the facts and limit the influence of personal, preconceived notions and prejudices. Scientific method facilitates in minimizing research errors. Limitations. The scientific method is a powerful tool, but it does have its limitations. These limitations are based on the fact that a hypothesis must be testable and falsifiable, that is, it is the capacity for some proposition, statement, theory or hypothesis to be proven wrong, and that experiments and observations are reliable and valid. This places certain topics beyond the reach of the scientific method. Scientists are human and share the same weaknesses as all members of the human race. The scientific method fails to yield an accurate representation of the world, not because of the method, but because of those who are attempting to apply it. The method fails when scientists themselves, usually collectively, allow their own biases and personal preferences to influence the hypothesis testing part of the process. Some other limitations are constrained by the extent of existing knowledge. Design of experiment is limited to observation method and instrument. Deliberately falsifying results, that is scientific fraud. Data interpretation, research findings are limited by human ability to interpret the results. Wrong interpretations can lead to wrong conclusions. It does not take into account inconsistent processes. Anthropomorphization, which is using observations obtained by sheer intuition or empathy. Scientist is part of what is being studied. The controlled environments and instruments that are used in scientific inquiry only can produce answers that are relevant to same controlled environments and instruments. The scientific method is a system that attempts to separate the bias of being an observer from the observation, that is, letting reality show itself in the simplest possible way. The primary steps of scientific method are systematic and repeatable observation, exact measurements, experiments, and the invention of and repeated, ideally nearly endless testing of theories. The important steps in scientific method are formulating research question, research existing sources, that is review of literature, formulation of hypothesis, design and conduct of study, and finally analysis of data and drawing conclusions. Scientific method provides an objective, standardized approach to conduct research and in doing so improves their results. Scientific method facilitates in minimizing research errors. Indeed, the scientific method is a powerful tool, but it does have its limitations. These limitations are based on the fact that a hypothesis must be testable and falsifiable, and that experiments and observations are reliable and valid.